Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's great to see you here in the Levitt Auditorium of the Des Moines Art Center on this rather rainy, gray Sunday afternoon, but we'll leave much happier and enlightened after the conversation between Luke and Samantha. My name is Kelly Baum, and I'm the John and Mary Papajohn Director of this great institution, the Des Moines Art Center. Thank you for joining us. I am very excited to introduce our speakers today, Samantha Box and Luke Williams. Samantha is a Jamaican-born, Bronx-based photographer who creates layered, visually arresting images that explore the intersection of identity and belonging. Ranging across the genres of still life, landscape, portraiture, and self-portraiture, Samantha's photographs are at once incisive and poetic. You can find two different bodies of work by Samantha on view at the Art Center. The first appears in her exhibition, which is curated by Dr. Mia Laufer, on view in our Anna K. Meredith galleries, subtitled Caribbean Dreams. The second, The Invisible Archive, appears in an exhibition Samantha co-organized with Mia for our John Brady Print Gallery. Samantha holds an MFA in Advanced Photographic Studies from ICP Bard College. Her work has been widely exhibited at institutions such as the Houston Center of Photography, the DePaul Art Museum, the Leslie Lohman Museum of Art, and the International Center of Photography. She has been in residence at Lightwork and the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and has been awarded fellowships from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Silver Eye Center of Photography, and on Foco, Inc. Samantha will be in conversation with Luke Williams, who we're also very pleased to welcome to the Art Center. This is his first trip to Iowa, very brave to do so in December. I told him that I had my interview for this role at the Art Center in January, and yes, that is, that's a gamble for sure. Luke is a scholar, artist, organizer, and critic of 20th and 21st century Black performance and visual cultures. He teaches in the Department of Theater and Dance at one of my favorite universities in the country, the University of Texas at Austin, where I got my start as an assistant curator over 20 years ago. Luke's work focuses on the art of the Black diaspora in the Americas and the broader Atlantic world. He earned his PhD in modern thought and literature at Stanford University. He is currently drafting a book based on his dissertation, In the Black: Figures of Racial Capitalism. Luke's writing and scholarship are inextricable from his practice as an artist, performer, and choreographer. Of his work, he has said, and here I'm quoting from his website, "My art making follows a Black feminist tradition of dynamic imagination and critical action." He is the perfect interlocutor for the conversation today with Samantha. Now, before I hand the stage over to Samantha and Luke, I want to thank my colleagues at the Art Center for planning and realizing this event. In particular, those in the curatorial, learning and engagement, communications, facilities, and security departments. A very special shout out to our Senior Director of Learning and Engagement, Jill Featherstone. I also want to express my gratitude to the organizations that provided financial support to Samantha's exhibition. And they are the Harriet S. and J. Locke Mackamer Art Center Fund and the Every Page Foundation. And before I dismiss myself, I want to draw your attention to this fabulous catalog, which is produced in partnership with the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. This is a book that documents Samantha's exhibitions here at the Art Center and also at that museum in D.C. You can find it in the bookstore at the Art Center. So with that, please join me in giving a hearty welcome to Samantha and Luke.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, so kind. I always get nervous when people quote from my website because I'm like, oh goodness, what did I write?
Oh my God, same, yeah. I was like, that bio, this sounds so horrible. Like, yeah.
I hope it's still good.
I know, really. I'm going to now rewrite everything.
I'm delighted to be here, to be in conversation with you. Even just from the preliminary getting to know each other, your work is so thoughtful, inquisitive, interesting, and inspiring. So I know the conversation will be exactly that. So thanks for having me join you in conversation today.
And I mean, thank you for also the same. I mean, like, I feel like we've had some time to really sit down and like talk about so many different things and like the show, the work, Black art, and I know that this is going to be a really amazing conversation. And so thank you for being here. Like, I really, really sincerely, like, want to thank you for that. And also, like, thank you, Kelly and Jill and the entire Des Moines Arts Center for like, and all of you for coming as well, for hosting the show and for allowing, for giving space for both Caribbean Dreams and Invisible Archive to have a space, not only in conversation with the museum's collection, but just like in the fullness of what it could be, I guess, especially regarding Caribbean Dreams. So thank you very much. Thank you.
All right, so my first question today is inspired by a little trip I took this morning. I went out for a walk to a convenience, DGK, did I get that? I went to the DGK. And it had me, your work was on my mind because we've been talking about it for the last couple days. And walked into the store, they've got the grocery aisle and the different items, and I just thought, wow, we're talking about still life today. We're talking about diaspora. We're talking about identity and the pushes and pulls there. My first question is, if you could be any one thing in a grocery store,
That's great.
what thing would you pick that like encapsulates you?
Oh wow, that is a wonderful question. I will say I have been to that DGK because like, and I was, when I walked in there, I was just like, oh my, I was like, where are we? Like, it was like this like portal into this different world of like, what a hodgepodge. Like, I was there specifically for water, and I was just like, but I ended up going up and down every single aisle because like it felt as if somebody had just kind of said like, oh well, we have these things, and they were like, oh yes, we do need like 10 million jars of pickles or something like that. Like, it was like so weird. And I did actually have that impetus to kind of like maybe buy something that could be used in a still life actually, because I was just like, this is just intense, like I do love a dollar store just because of that kind of like randomness, like treasure trove randomness, and that DGK definitely has it. I should go back, actually. Let's see, what would I be in a grocery store? I'm thinking like, what would I buy to feed myself more? But like, it would probably be something like, I know this sounds a little bit silly, but perhaps like, I was gonna say like the basket or like the Tupperware, or like something that ends up being like used and used and used like over and over again. I mean, I'm thinking maybe about Tupperware specifically, like, not just for the plastic, but like the way that like, there's like that kind of like simultaneous disposability, but also space of collection, how it gets kind of funky. I end up like always repurposing my Tupperware into like plant pots after it sort of like reaches a certain point. Like, it has this like thinking about Tupperware too is like the thing that, when one goes to like a dinner, like at someone's house, like, like that sort of like piece of Tupperware that gets like filled with something, leftovers, for example, and like you take it back with you, and like, yeah, perhaps Tupperware.
That's fascinating. Okay, the follow-up question then, plastic or glass Tupperware? Like,
oh, so the glass is like the fancy one.
yeah, I just upgraded. And
Yeah,
I
no,
feel
it's great.
very,
Yeah, no,
like,
you
good
should.
about
It's
myself.
great. Oh no, it's amazing. I know, I love the glass stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I think like I have a real fondness, like, and that's actually what I use at home. Like, but I have a real fondness for just like the stuff that, like the takeout Tupperware that gets repurposed into something else. Like, my mom actually has like this, and one of my good friends too has this amazing, I'm gonna be generous and call it a collection, but it's basically just sort of like this hoarder pile of like, leftover, like there's like sort of like takeout containers. And so like when I go to either one of their houses and I'm like, oh, like, do you have something like put this in? They're like, oh yes, look. And like they open up a closet and it's just like this like giant thing. And I'm like, wow, like so much plastic, like so much like reuse, like what is going on here? And then like, yeah, the glass up is better though, it is.
In my parents' house, the several cabinets of plastic takeout, not supposed to be reused, but gets reused. My dad called them the renegades. So you're a renegade.
Oh yeah.
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 And I love that because in your work, you're thinking about value, thinking about labor, thinking about how the qualities that we assign through those lenses get ascribed and circulated. And I'm curious if we can think with you a little bit in those terms, moving from the Tupperware into what that looks like when you start taking images.
That's a wonderful question. So when I'm thinking about value and labor in the work, I'm thinking about it as related. It appears in a couple of different forms. The first is the way that using fruits and vegetables and the plants and the seedlings as analogies for the bodies of those of us who've historically in the modern world, in our current times, been transported around the world and whose labor has been sort of like used and commodified. And so I'm speaking about the histories of enslaved Africans, indentured Indian people, and then the union of those like groups of people in spaces like the Caribbean where their bodies were and their knowledge were used to in the service of creating income, right, for several empires. And then the way in which, like, you know, again, speaking, I guess, like personally at this point, my family and then actually other members of the Caribbean diaspora have been transported around the world or made to remove themselves from this space into another space, again, based on these ideas of like value and labor and knowledge and across borders. And so, so that's one way in which it appears. The other way in which it appears is very much actually connected to the idea of the Tupperware, right? This idea of something that like ostensibly has no value, but then there's value perhaps like placed on it. It can hold value. It can itself sort of like be a container for something. It can, at the same time, like this, like sort of like there's a disposability of product. Like on its surface, a Tupperware has no value, right? And so in more recent work, I've been interested in using things that on their surface have no sort of material value, such as like mylar or like acrylic or low-res images pulled from the internet or or like air fresheners or things like that, to speak about like the way that to create this like point at which like when we're thinking especially about like the exploitation around, again, like labor, people, knowledge, cultures that happen in the Caribbean, and we're using that idea of like this valueless product, then we have to start thinking about like where does this like our understanding of that value happen, and really sort of reflect on like the way that the value, again, of like the people, labor, products, culture, what does that really sort of like mean, you know? I really enjoy actually also like using materials like tape and like clamps and like that kind of like weird disco paper, you know, or like lenticular prints or like things that like on their surface, again, like are often couched as being something that is like sub-value, you know, like maybe they're cheesy, maybe it's like a low-res image, you know, like maybe it's like a sticker, an air freshener, and like really sort of like pointing, again, like using that again to point to like what our understanding of value actually is, and why some things are valued and why maybe some things are like spoken about in a certain way. So like with the air freshener, the idea that it's called like Caribbean colada, like it's supposed to sort of like create this linkage between this like cheap air freshener back to this like expansive idea of value around the Caribbean, but ultimately like it's a failure of linkage, you know? And I'm interested in that failure. Yeah.
My own research relates to value, and some of the conclusions that I draw by looking at value both in the art market but also value in financial markets is that we need to have more distinctions between how we talk about value, because in some cases, such as when you talk about stocks or future value, the utility of the thing is its lack of value. because what we're interested in is the growth or the profit or the, by making the initial amount expendable, we can create a future thing that will yield profits. So in many ways, the Caribbean was this area for extreme capital extraction off of individuals who were devalued. That value is extracted for the creation of the modern world, right? And so, and all parts of that process were necessary in order to get a product of capitalism that we see that continues to extract on an even larger scale and continues to devalue people differentially. And to be able to get there from like plastic, from disposable paper, from Tupperware, is one of the things that I find most compelling about your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Another question that I had was, we might just talk about this Tupperware the whole time.
Yeah.
But the difference between analogy, between, this thing is analogous to, and representation. This thing stands in for. I think that also gets us into the territory of talking about how do we talk about identity without talking about identity in art. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on, this is a distinction I'm imposing, so I don't know if it's useful to think about a difference between analogy and representation, maybe through metaphor or something like that.
Well, so in my mind, I think about like representation. I think it's maybe a little bit reductive, but like, the idea of like, this is what like the use of the body comes in, and or a direct sort of like one-to-one understanding of like artifacts or products, right? And so like,
One-to-one.
yeah, and so like, for example, like, like when the body, so in full disclosure, we've actually had a very long conversation about like the way that the body functions, especially in photography, and like how often, especially with like Black bodies, like when it appears in the image, there's a collapse around narrative, or a collapse into a received narrative of the Black body, right? And so I think about that like often with representation, and so like when. And then there's also sort of, so that one-to-oneness, right? Like the one-to-one between like the body and the received narrative. And then sometimes there's also like a representation that could happen with like the direct use of a product to kind of like represent something, right? Like, so the idea of like, displaced product, like, sort of like that's a direct one-to-one with a displaced person, for example, right? I'm more interested in the idea of the analogy, right? Because I think that like when we start thinking about the analogy, now what happens is that like the narrative expands all the way out, right? And so, or in my mind it does, right? So like now, instead of like, for example, like a particular fruit standing in for, let's say, for example, like my grandmother, right? Like it actually like becomes something that's like, it's all of us, right? Like the conversation goes from like something that is perhaps like, it starts off with the idea of like, well, like these fruits and vegetables, for example, and their seedlings come from the space that like is also the space that I come from. And perhaps like by not all of the fruits and vegetables, for example, in some of the images like are directly from Jamaica or from Trinidad, but are from this like general region, right? And so like when we start making analogies, now we can start talking also about like what the immigrant experience is like as well, right? And so tying in the idea of enslavement and indenture into this larger kind of like how that influences or like really sort of like undergirds the patterns or our ideas of immigration from those places as well, right? And part of this too is like I think that like objects like fruits and vegetables, like tablecloths and other things like that, like there's an understanding of like what is the meaning beyond this like literal or sentimental level of an understanding of the thing, right? And so when we're looking actually at like, to engage in analogy also means to think about like, what are the historic streams or like backgrounds of this particular thing, right? So like one can't really sort of like take a fruit or an object at its own service level, but like there's really questions that like trail behind it of like, a history that's attached to it that like starts influencing these other understandings of it. And so like, I think that like when like the object starts expanding, it becomes an analogy, right? And like in that expansion, like that's when we can start really sort of like thinking about, again, like sort of like how does this history relate? How does it continue? Like how is it relating to like not only like maybe my experience, but again, also this wider experience, you know? Whereas representation, I think, feels just like very much like there's only one meaning, like, and there's like, it's very, very, it's like hard to kind of like get away from that one meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So reflecting back, I mean, it seems like representation can be definitional and directional, singular in a sense, whereas analogy can be relational. And it can open up ways for us to think about relationship between you and me, relationship between us and audience, relationship between audience and each other, between audience and space, and all the different ways that we exist within Venn diagrams of relationships, rather than as matrices of you are this, I am this, I can only access this, or my range of expression is limited here, as opposed to here, over here, in this space. It opens up the possibility for multiple modes.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that like, like around the idea of the Tupperware, this like piece of plastic, this thing that like, this residue, I guess, like of this like modern age that we live in, like the idea of like using that in this particular sort of like context, which is like a thicket, right? It's like a thicket of history and of meaning and like of like all of these things. I think that like, it becomes like, it's almost like akin, if you would imagine, like, for this little piece of Tupperware to be floating on top of this like very choppy sea, right? And using plastic and using like fake things, I think, I mean, for me at least, it kind of like presents this like this moment where, again, like how do we kind of like, there isn't anything to really sort of like push back against, right? There isn't anything to kind of like, how do we find that maybe there is no framework to kind of like push back against? Like, how is this plastic related to the Caribbean? It's like related because of this idea of like artifice, right? And also this idea of disposability, this idea of like this detritus of the modern world, perhaps, right? And also things that are like cheap and of value, devalued, that have been devalued, And so I really enjoy that. Like I enjoy like using things like this, like using something like a Tupperware. Maybe I will use a Tupperware now in one of my still lives, right? Because like it's a slippery, like there's no traction, like there's no real traction. It's hard to kind of, and then like now we're in the space that's like a space of analogy, but like you're kind of spinning a little bit, and and I enjoy that. Like I enjoy sort of like, not only in when I make the work, but also just like when it goes out into the world, like that, like there is this, there's so many potential ideas about what could be happening, that the image becomes a little illegible, and also like so many meanings can perhaps come out of it that like the meaning itself also becomes a little illegible as well.
I'm writing my feature book here, and this might be a line in here, so quote me if you use this line. Modernity is the spaghetti stain on the Tupperware of history.
Yeah.
You can't scrub it out.
You really can't. No, it's horrible. Curry is actually second to that. Like, oh man, like forget that. Like, yeah, that's a plant pot then. Like, yeah, no.
So I want to ground us a little bit because we're tackling big ideas, which is great. That's what we're here to do, and that's what makes this fun and exciting. Anchors can be helpful. Grounding can be helpful. Frames can be helpful. I want to talk about the Caribbean as a frame. Title of the exhibition, Caribbean Dreams. Caribbean one way of framing through Caribbean is identity and nationality. Another way of framing through Caribbean is history, routes, circulation. Can you bring us into that space? Like, what is the frame that Caribbean provides for your work as you're making? Or maybe let me rephrase it. Is it a helpful frame for your work as you're making, and in what way?
So, I have to say, like when the work first began, it was the frame that the frame of identity was probably the most useful one, right? And when I say that, what I mean is like specifically like not only like my own identity, like my own personal lived experience, but also the experience of like my parents and my extended family and ancestors. And so there was very much like this idea of like not trying to translate this experience particularly, but like, really thinking about like, well, what does it mean to have been born into this space, into this like, into this Caribbean space, and then to have like migrated to America, to have immigrated to America, and what does that mean for me to be here, right? And so I was really thinking about it very much like, actually, this is like thinking about this now. In some ways, like there were moments of like the use of like family archival images or heirlooms, which perhaps would have been at that point representational, right? Like direct kind of like things of like, well, this is this, right? Alongside this kind of analogous use of like produce and other things like that. And then like as I really like started thinking beyond that, or just like, like learning actually also like more about like the way that the histories of the Caribbean are really the histories of the things that we've been talking about. Like, I'm almost certain that we're going to say the word value like 10 million billion times in this talk, right? But the histories of value and labor and of routes of people and commodification of people and the transportation of people. Then I started thinking about it in a way such that like now I'm thinking about it that like perhaps the conversation has happened because I am from that place, and so like these things have impacted me, and again like the lives of the people who came before me and who will come after me. But like now that framework is actually broadened into this like other sort of thing, and so like now the Caribbean, the framework that I'm thinking about regarding the Caribbean is about these questions of labor, and about like the way in which like the Caribbean has really sort of like been this like testing ground of like of so many things, right? Like certainly capitalism, right? Like this kind of like place in which like capitalism is like refined into the sharp edge that it is right now. The way that like global routes of commodification of like products and stuff like that like really sort of like start and really sort of like reach a point of amplification, especially during the era of enslavement and colonialism in the Caribbean. The way that like the way that a space can be mined for its resources on multiple different levels. And so like, for example, in the Caribbean, it goes from sugar, the farming of sugar and other products into like, into the exploitation through tourism. And like now we're potentially facing the idea of like exploitation or privatization of Caribbean spaces because of climate change, right? And so like that kind of slipperiness of capitalism. And so that's how I'm really sort of like thinking about it. It's become sort of like, so I'm really thinking about this as, to paraphrase Fairleigh Baez, like how the way that the Caribbean really is a crucible of the modern world, right? In the ways that I've sort of described. And like tangentially, even like the ideas of like when we understand like botany, like these things come from the Caribbean as well, right? And so like there's so much that like if you kind of like think about the formation of like the Caribbean as this kind of like space of exploitation, the echoes of that moment like have like strongly reverberated and are still reverberating throughout the world, and you can sort of like pick it up, like you can kind of like trace that thread. And so like now like the Caribbean is very much that. Like it's like not a theoretical framework, but like I guess like it's perhaps leaning towards that more than it is like leaning towards like a kind of embodied narrative. Yeah. Like it's a framework in which I happen to be caught up in. Does that make sense? Like,
It does
like
make
versus
sense.
like the other way, like where it's like an embodied narrative and then there's an extra framework on top of it. Yeah.
And my next question is going to poke at this a little bit, exactly that. So Cedric Robinson has this quote. CLR James starts off his book about Haiti, the revolution in Saint Domingue, Toussaint Louverture, and he starts this book with, at times, I'm paraphrasing, at times the cannons of the revolution came in most clear when at my desk overlooking the sea. So like basically he's saying, but my interpretation of what he's saying, is there is a clarity which distance provides of not being there-ness, of being at a remove in order to cement the ideas and to distill the understanding, and yet also the loss that comes from being at a remove. And so me provoking and pushing forward, what does it mean then to use the Caribbean as a frame when, as you're talking about, it is at a distance to you? We are in Des Moines, Iowa.
Yeah.
We are not next to the Caribbean right now.
Yeah.
And we're talking about it. So how can we think about it and talk about it with clarity in a way that is, can that distance provide us a clarity of from where we are, having it be helpful for us as we think about it? That's where the question's going.
Yeah. Well, I know for me particularly, I also on my experience, and then we can kind of broaden it out. But I actually think that could this work have been made if I was living in the Caribbean? No. Right? I don't think so.
Interesting.
I really don't think so. And I think that sometimes it's when you're I'll give you an example. This is how I know the answer to this question is that I'm right about this, right? Is because I just kind of assumed that if you would ask me this question perhaps 2 or 3 months ago, I would have said oh, well, it's because what does it mean to kind of live in a space and then to kind of really analyze the space? It's very hard to do that, right? To kind of have that kind of sense of objectivity or pulling oneself back from why is it like this? You know what I'm saying, right? And so this is kind of very much a tangent, but this will add some understanding to this. I paid a visit to a historic house in the Bronx, right? So about 30 minutes by car from where I live. That was the home of a prominent Dutch family. So I was invited to take a tour of this house and kind of talk about different things. And on the way there, I was struck by this revelation that oh right, New York City was part of the Dutch Empire. Okay, and so and this is what I'm saying, right? So it's I live in this space. I see Dutch names all the time. We talk about this it's the colors of the Knicks and the Mets, that blue and orange, come from this sort of Dutch inheritance, right? But the way that after I don't know 5 or 6 years of doing this work, that moment, that realization happened only 3 months ago. This is what I'm saying, right? So sometimes it's you need to having that distance is the thing that helps you to understand something, right? If it wasn't for the fact that I was going across this borough to kind of think about well, why would they I was really thinking it's why would they invite me here to take a look at this place? And then that's when it hit me, right? So the way that, for example, empire and these systems can live within plain view, but of course in this particular house it was essentially sort of the locus of multiple empires, so not just the Dutch Empire, but also the way in which after that empire ceded New York City and that space became a British space, how the products of that house went down to the Caribbean, came back, and I was standing in this little tiny house, looking over the playing fields, which of this park in which the house is grounded, which actually used to be the plantation fields of that house in which enslaved people worked. And I was struck by the way that again, different levels of empire can just sort of exist in this space, but exist almost invisibly because they get erased, right? Because they're just kind of they get rendered so mundane as to kind of just be almost unexaminable, right? And so that was a real sort of moment. Yeah. Sometimes the universe will slap you in the face, and I was very happy for it actually. I was just wow, this is just making my brain spin. And so I think that if I was living in the Caribbean space, for a variety of different reasons, where would the impetus have been for me to examine these things, but I think that like perhaps I would not have been able to, right? Because like, you know, thinking about like the land, thinking about the people, thinking about the structures, you know, I think that, yeah, like it maybe would have been too close. But living, of course, like in the tri-state area and like, you know, like there is this like that remove, it's a simultaneous remove and also it's a different type of closeness, right? Because like now I'm close to like members of the community, or like I'm living close to members of the community in different parts of it. You know, there's a saying that there's like more Jamaicans outside of Jamaica than in Jamaica. And like, so like I'm probably living in a more Jamaican space than if I was living in Jamaica itself. But that distance of like, you know, really sort of thinking about like, what does it mean for me to be here? What does it mean for me to potentially like think about going back there? Or like, what would it be like? Like, where do I stand in relationship to that is actually like really important, I think. So, and then I also think that like, and I think that distance then has allowed me to kind of like step back, like critically and like to kind of like think about like, well, how do these objects function? How are they in motion in the way that my body is in motion? And then another step back, why are they in motion, right? And then like another step back, like what are these other systems that are forcing them into motion, right? And then and then at every single point really sort of like interrogating like what is my understanding of this Caribbean space as well, right? And I think like that's really, I would say sort of like not change, but like even that framework has really has broadened, right? Because of thinking about, for example, like, well, why did this happen? Like, how come these things happen in such a way that, you know, why movement from one place to another, for example, right? And then I think like when we start taking that out, again, like another couple of steps into a space like Des Moines, which is like, I mean, I would say like there are Jamaicans in Des Moines, right? And, you know, and like but then that's a further opportunity for a lot of the narratives around the Caribbean to kind of like fall apart even more. And then in so doing, like in the sort of disillusion of those narratives potentially is maybe an exposure of the systems that happen underneath, yeah.
I'm going to try something out as I'm listening to you.
Not free association. No. Like, you know, like so.
Distance, the experience of distance. Something that empire is able to create. And what I mean when I say that is empire, colonialism, they create a civilized and an uncivilized. They create a colonizer and colonized, a proper, improper, an outside other is over there. We, the good and just, are here. So it creates that distance. By doing so, attempts to erase, in many ways, that outside influence, which is often actually very internal. And in doing so, in creating that distance, creates a fantasy, something that is out of sight but ever present in the imaginary. It is the way that the exotic becomes erotic. It is the way that that which is created as being far away gets imagined as being fantastic. I'm wondering if analogy helps to close that distance. Because what analogy is asking of us is to empathize with whatever it is that we believe is far away. Because it's, oh, I can understand not through direct understanding, which is what colonialism attempts to do. I can extract, I can interpret, I can identify. Analogy asks us to relate in a way that is within the realm of our understanding, while never fully closing the circle on what we're trying to understand, but still closing a distance of sorts so that we can form different modes of relation. I'm trying this out for the first time. What do you think?
Well, so I think that's interesting. I mean, but I think I would prefer the idea that like analogy brings us closer, like not because of empathy, but because you're forced to kind of like think about, you're actually forced to think about it. That, you know what I'm saying? Like you're like, and so there's, I think analogy can bring up like a series of questions, or potentially, right? Like a series of like ruptures of received thought or received narrative that force you to kind of like sit with perhaps the discomfort of those ruptures, and then also to kind of like reform or to reorient yourself around the answers to those questions. I don't think that like, I will say that like, I don't make my work with this idea of sort of like the idea of empathy, or like try to create this idea of empathy, and like, which I think sometimes like is, I'm not gonna say like it's a misplaced emotion, but often it's something that like is not, it can be something that like is a very fleeting sort of emotion, right? But what I'm thinking about is like that kind of, again, like the rupture of thought, right? So like the analogy ruptures thought, and then in the act of having to think about what that means, it does bring ideas closer, you know, and like, and perhaps like never, I'm also interested in the idea that like the ideas could actually like, kind of like an asymptote, like never actually meet each other, right? There's always going to be like this, like, a moment, I guess, like where things cannot be defined entirely, like it's like not pat, it's not one-to-one, it's a little bit, there's a little bit of chaos that's happening between kind of like the two nodes of that. But yeah, but I do agree that like, you know, but I think it's like in the idea of like really sort of like confronting the rupture.
Yeah.
That's when the closeness or the gap starts maybe narrowing. Yeah.
I love that you said asymptote. You know, we're art folks, we're culture folks. Everyone assumes we don't know math. Maybe that's true. But
Yeah.
I wrote an article about the asymptote because what I found in it was a beautiful metaphor, a beautiful representation, literally, of impossibility. It is a mathematical representation of the impossibility of Y.
Right.
No matter how X you go, it's just not going to happen.
Right. Yeah.
And so I love being able to think about what are those axes where things become impossible, no matter how hard you try.
Well, I mean, the cool thing about the asymptote too is that like, I mean, I will tell you that like, I actually have the hardest time doing like regular, because I think I have like sort of like the equivalent of math dyslexia, right? But I was so happy in finally making it to calculus, because I was like, oh, like I was like, why can't they just like teach math like this all the time? Like
perfect
it
sense.
makes perfect sense. Like it like really does. Like, and it's beautiful actually. Like it is entirely beautiful. I mean, I think about the asymptote as also like one of this like this thing, like the futility of explaining, right? So like, you know, I think, and photography.
You got to slow this down. You got to slow this one down.
Okay,
The
so like
futility of explaining.
the futility of explaining. And so like, so there's a couple of different levels of this, right? And so like the first is that like, I cannot speak for like everyone in the Caribbean. I can't speak for all 8 million Jamaicans, and then the related number of Trinidadian people, and then everybody else, right? And so, once I kind of like, you know, when you like kind of like go, and this becomes about the question of representation as well, right? So I can't represent everyone. I can only sort of like talk about my own experiences, right? I do think that work is always like better when it's rooted in the subjective and then is allowed to kind of expand into something else versus into a more universal space perhaps, like rather than the other way around, right? So that's one level of sort of like, you know, of explanation. And then like the way that photography too has been sort of like used, and is still used to explain the world, to render the world banal, to explain the world to other people. So in other words, to explain or to define the other on behalf of a white middle class audience, right?
Like catalog and circulate.
Exactly.
And capture.
Yes. And so there's that resistance as well, right? And I think about like how like the asymptote is, it is such a beautiful idea because like it can never collapse into a number, right? And so like when we start thinking about like using photography or like the camera mechanism as something that like to make work that doesn't collapse, right? That never will maybe sort of like get close to a thing, but like acknowledges actually that it can never sort of like do the actual thing. I think it's like a really, really interesting, not a refutation, but kind of like a pushback against the way that like photography has been historically and contemporarily used.
Yeah.
And I feel like I forgot the other part of your question.
Oh, I did too, but what,
That's awesome. Yeah.
but what popped in mind was it really forces us to think about what is Don Henley talking about when he says take it to the limit. That's the asymptote, right?
Right, yeah.
You're not going to get to the limit, Don.
Yeah, no, totally, yeah, exactly. But I think that like there's something that's like so amazing about that, like about like there's like so many possibilities then, right? I mean, I think this also goes back into the idea of like the complicated narrative or like just like something that's like a little bit chaotic. Like, I mean, as X goes into infinity, it's just like there's multiples. Like there's like this beautiful sort of like way that like, how far can you extend that analogy, right? Like how far can that framework be expanded? How big can that rupture be? That I'm really down with. Yeah.
Thinking expansively, right? We're already there. The exhibition, one of the exhibitions titled Caribbean Dreams. I'm curious about speaking from the subjective, from the you experience. How would you describe your dream?
Of the Caribbean?
Of where you're headed, right? When you think about the possibility of dreaming and the ability to create that which exists at a distance or does not yet exist, thinking broadly as we do with the asymptote of the infinite possibility, I'm curious, could you begin to talk about the possibility that you think of for yourself or what you might be hoping for or things of that nature, right? The act of dreaming stemming from the you.
Oh, that is such a question. Okay,
My
so,
students hate me.
exactly. It's like, oh no, it's like, I don't know. Let's see. So, I mean, I think there's like so one thing that's like really sort of like amazing and remarkable about this moment, about having this exhibition, is like the way in which like it sort of like closed down some chapters and closed down some lines of thought, as well as like how it's like also created a space of like opening, right? And so like, so some things, so I'm gonna sort of like answer this like from the personal to the less so. And so, I mean, there's all these things now of like, oh my God, like maybe I can start doing installation more and like, sculpture, like that's like fancy. And then also like ways of like thinking about like, how can I push that language of value further? I think like, I realized that like, like there's like ways, there's so many ways to go with this, so many steps that I could take that are maybe more bold, other ways of like playing with like vision and the print and what is a photograph, how a photograph is presented, that like are things that are kind of like questions that are lighting my brain up in different sort of ways. Yeah, I don't know, like it's really hard to say exactly what this means, except for like I just kind of like feel that like a good sort of like the top of my brain has been blown off, and like now there's like all this extra room, and all of these questions that are like begging to be answered, and that I think is going to sort of like, move the work into this like really interesting place, and I'm excited about that. Then I guess like regarding like the actual like Caribbean itself, like as like as a framework, as this framework, I'm really interested in, I mean, this is a sort of like desire to like flip the whole entire rock of empire around the Caribbean and to kind of like show a certain amount of like, not explain, but to kind of like really engage in this like underbelly, I guess. And then this, I would love it, I guess, like in the act of doing so, that I guess like perhaps like there's like, and again, like this is not about like explaining anything or telling anyone anything, but I guess like there's like a desire that like an understanding of the Caribbean becomes like as this proving ground, this testing ground, these killing fields, right? Like becomes something that is a narrative or an understanding that almost like overwhelms any kind of like, for example, tourist ad, you know? And I think that's like perhaps also true for like the New World in general, you know, like the New World in general, like that there's like an exposure and maybe understanding about like, why are things the way they are? Like, where did like tomatoes, for example, like, or these like things, like these moments of rupture, like these like rotten systems. Like, I just kind of like want that to be out in the open, I guess. And so I think about what that means. I mean, I think there's like some really interesting like research that's happening that are like, that really is connecting the Caribbean with this like really reconnecting, right? Like we're kind of like bringing back into conversation like these connections between the Caribbean and like America and other parts of the world. And I'm like really excited by that. And I'm hoping that like maybe my work can be a part of that conversation.
Beautiful. Yeah. I think that might be a good opportunity for us to transition to questions.
Oh, yeah.
If you'd like to, if there are folks in the audience who have questions, comments, my dad used to say questions, comments, or legitimate beefs. We accept those as well.
I always say questions, comments, or anxieties. Like, yeah.
We welcome all here, but I think now would be a good time, and I see some hands already.
I'm coming over to you. And the microphone is for everyone else to hear, so please do wait for that mic.
Hello. Hello.
Oh, hello. Oh, yeah.
I've really enjoyed this. I could listen to this a couple more hours, but if we're going to switch it over. When you were talking about value and things, I was a DJ for 6 years at a radio station, actually the first black college in Savannah, in Georgia, and Ike Carter ran the place. It was great. But one of the things that I was really interested in there was dub music, which came out of Jamaica. And I don't know, this is really just an observation, but when you're talking about value, and also just how things get sort of commodified and whatever, dub is like this really big type of music now. But I think a lot of people aren't even aware of its roots, which is really on the value because Lee Scratch Perry and King Tubby and all these other great producers from Jamaica, they only had limited amount of money, so they record a single song, and then the B-side was just them taking the same song and dropping the vocals out and throwing some reverb on it, and like that's how an entire genre of music was spawned, was just that they didn't have enough money to record 2 songs. Anyway, that's it. I don't really have any deep point to make about that, but I was just wondering if you had any connection to that, like the sound system culture was supposed to be really big in Jamaica, if you had any experiences with that.
Not directly with sound system culture, but in a sense, yes. I mean, it's like I grew up with like all of that music. Like I do love dub very much. I didn't know that dub was a big thing because I'm 47 right now. So like it's just like I don't really pay attention to like a lot of like, and that's not true. Like one should always pay attention, but like I just haven't been, right? And so that's kind of a surprise that people have been disconnecting dub from its foundational roots. And yeah, like it did come about because of like there were some financial constraints, but it was also kind of like, what else can this do, right? What else can this music do, this track do? And I think that like, that actually like, it's interesting. Like I do, in fact, listen to dub in my studio all the time when I make work, right? And there's one particular song especially that opens up like when I'm making stuff, like it, but the interesting thing about dub is like the way, again, like that kind of like use and reuse, that I think is like really, actually, like I think about that a lot with my work. It's like I'll use something until it's like done, and also dub is the reason why when DJ Kool Herc was spinning tracks in the Bronx, because he's Jamaican, that's how that also happened, because people started speaking over the track, and then it was like the using that, and that's how he created the beat, and that's why hip hop is the Jamaican music form. Sorry, we've been having a conversation about this. So but yes, but thank you for pointing that out.
I'm going to ask a clarifying question because I'm going to go look it up because I don't know what it is. Are you saying dub, D-U-B?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It's like it's wonderful music. Yeah.
There was a hand here and 2 up there.
We got you.
We're going to go to the back, and then we'll come down
I'll
front.
go first, but I just wanted to thank you because I have a 16-year-old daughter. I was a math major in college, but I have a 16-year-old daughter who tries to tell me that no one will ever use the word asymptote outside of a math classroom, and the number of times you said it today is very exciting for me to go home and tell her that it was at an art lecture, so thanks very much. What my question is, you're here in Iowa, and your show here, and obviously there isn't a large Caribbean experience here for us in Des Moines. So from that perspective, what do you hope for us as Iowans, especially to take away from your exhibit here?
So I think that like that point of rupture, an analogy, like, that I mentioned before is I mean, it's not just like, people in Iowa, but just in general, right? Like this, and actually I just want to just say very clearly like that, like, I'm not making this work for like, I make this work very much for like my own reasons. Like, like I'm not really thinking about like other people and what they couldn't necessarily get from it, like in terms of, again, that goes back to the idea of like explaining, which I'm like I refuse to do this, right? But I do think that like, one thing is, again, like that kind of like moment of rupture, right? So it's like when I'm looking at this image of the Caribbean, I know this is about the Caribbean, and it's featuring things like acrylic or like other sort of mylar or things that are like not what one would think about as being related to the Caribbean, that moment of rupture, that moment of disconnect, because then hopefully there's like a forcing of like, well, what is the Caribbean, right? And perhaps a realization of the way in which our understandings of the Caribbean, particularly from like a Western perspective or like kind of an American perspective, like this notion of like paradise, particularly, right? Like that perhaps like there's a fallacy to this, I think like the work rewards like a slower looking, and I think that like for maybe some people like there would be this, a question again of like, well, what does this have to do with this space? But then actually that's really it, right? Is forcing that, like that question. These were questions that like, I really enjoy using materials like that because I love how they photograph, like I love like the way that they look in images. But like when I started using those images, those particular materials as well, like I had to also think about like, well, in what way, right? And so the questions that like, I had to ask myself those questions, right? And to make the work. And so then those are the same questions that I hope come out of the work as well.
If I could add on to that, I would actually be interested from the audience perspective of what does the Iowa experience find in resonance with Samantha's work? Like that's something that I'm always curious about as an educator when I ask my students, we're all coming from a different place. Where are you finding the inroads? And then that gives us an avenue for asking why.
Actually, I want to say like, or not, or not.
Or not.
I think that's like also like really like an important part of it because it's like, sometimes like there's sometimes art or photography or like, can like kind of like provide an inroad, but sometimes it's also like not really like, there is a kind of like maybe a recognition of a point of like blockage of like, I'm trying to work through what this means, and, or not blockage, but kind of like a moment of of confrontation with like what one understands about something, right?
And both experiences invite more questions.
Right.
And that's the important part.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your insight. I appreciate the conversation thus far. I don't have a specific question as much as like sort of a rumination prompt. I was thinking about Tupperware earlier and how this ascribed valueless object takes on this spaghetti stain. So it takes on some of the thing that it contains, but also there's an interaction with the container and the matter within the container. So there's microplastics, of course, leaching into the food or into the people that consume from these, sort of like valueless objects. And so just thinking about that, maybe you guys could readdress that interaction, how the thing affects the container, the valueless container, in the sense of like diasporic Africans, like how the containing of whatever that thing is, whatever you think that metaphor is, whatever those people contain, but also how we affect, how the diaspora affects all the places that have tried to extract, whereas we have sort of the microplastics of Africanism in the colonial world,
Yeah.
or in the African world, however you see fit. So, a rumination prompt.
Yeah, no,
I love that question. There's a great article by Stacy Alamo called Transcorporeality. And basically the argument is humans are 90% water, right? Things come in and out of us regularly. When we think of ourselves as being porous, we can think about how we interact with our environment and our environment interacts with us. You mentioned microplastics, perfect example. And when we begin to take that as an analogy for larger experiences with systems of domination, we can also ask that question of how do they rub off on us? How do they habituate us? Why do you have back problems when you sit at your desk for 9 hours, right? But also, how do we rub off on those systems is a question that then prompts what type of behavior are you going to put back out into the environment? Thank you for the question.
I think about it in the way that
Samantha?
oh, sorry. As my comment about hip hop being Jamaican music was a little bit snarky, but it's actually also true. And so the way that there's yesterday over dinner we were actually talking about Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, and the way that in that book or series of essays, she talks about how I'm going to paraphrase you, and so please jump in if I am wrong. But how paraphrasing you, paraphrasing her, right? And so but basically that the project of 20th century white literature uses the shadow of the black figure to basically as the ground from which to understand the delineation of whiteness.
I think you got that word for word.
And so and so I think about it I think about it in that kind of way. I also think about it in the context of the Black Atlantic sound that Paul Gilroy talks about, right? And so this it's not just hip hop, it's hip hop into lovers rock, into Afrobeat, and this kind of unification of sound around, right? So there's that sonic valence, right? That in which you can't get away from us because we're literally in the air, right? And then there's these other things as well. I think about this a lot, when, for example, even things hot chocolate, that was essentially something that was extracted from Jamaica because the person who ended up selling the recipe to Cadbury saw enslaved African women creating hot chocolate and as a nutritional thing for their children, right? And so there's that presence. Do you know what I'm saying? I'm thinking about there are these and then hot chocolate actually becomes something that ends up being used along with sugar to kind of drive the Industrial Revolution, right? So I'm thinking about the shadows, I'm thinking about these spaces that are actually very, very, very black, right? When you take a step back and you look at it, why is it like that? It's just that's actually a very black thing, and there's more of that than I think than we realize, And I know that the hot chocolate example sounds very sort of silly, but I think that's something that it's fundamental in some ways to this understanding of it's wintertime, it's hot chocolate, but actually that's a Jamaican thing, and I think there's something about this that I find really interesting because going back to the idea of flipping the rock, right? So it's not just flipping the rock, but if you actually flip the world over, there's this whole narrative of the world that's actually very much a whole perspective on the world and a whole sort of understanding of the world when you think about it from a very black space, right? And it is actually an understanding that is when you sort of realize these things, and a lot of that understanding has been elided or erased, right? But when you understand how some of these things actually happen, it's oh, right, here we are, right? I'm really interested in that idea, and I think I also kind of try to make my, I mean, really sort of like, I make my work from that space more than the other way around, you know? So, yeah.
I think it's my turn. Okay. I just really wanted to say I really appreciate your work. I'm part Hawaiian, and so seeing your work and seeing how the way I interpreted your work was reconnecting to your culture when you're not currently in that space can be hard and lonely, like how you guys kind of talked about in conversation. I guess the question I had from listening to this whole conversation is, do you ever feel like you have to teach people through your art about your culture? I'm a musician, and so a lot of times I feel like I'm constantly being a teacher for somebody that doesn't understand the culture, which is okay, but sometimes can be tiring, you know?
So, you know, I have to say that I teach, I'm a professor. I refuse to teach in my work. I think that, like, there's, like, we all have this supercomputer in our pockets, right? And I think that, and I think that's like, but I mean, but even before we had these, right? Like, I think like there's like really this like, and this actually goes back into sort of like the labor of work, right? The labor of making work and the labor of being somebody who is like in a, quote, non-traditional art body, right? Okay, and so like, and I think that like that amount of like the, this is a question, for example, like no one has ever, like, no one asked the estate of Edward Hopper or anybody else like that to explain their work, to explain his work. No one really sort of like asked that question, like why is like there's like why do I have to bear the onus of explaining things to other people? When, like, you know, when I was a child and I had to read Catcher in the Rye, did you have to read Catcher in the Rye, right? Like, nobody explained that to me, but, like, I had to figure it out, right? Because, like, that's what it means to be an informed reader, or, like, a reader who can read, right? Or, like, or just, like, but there was also a presumption that I should know these things, right? That I should know Holden Caulfield's experience, and because of this idea of like, this is the culture that I needed to know, right? And so I refuse. I do not do that. And I don't think that anyone should, right? And I think that like, and again, I think like kind of like, and I'm not trying to be harsh with you, right? But I think that like, you know, there's again like this idea of labor here, right? Of like having to like, the labor of having to educate, it's just like, this is ridiculous. Like, no, the thing that I labor on is my work, right? And like, and I ask myself questions and I answer their questions through the work, right? And like, and I think that like, when we have to explain ourselves, right? And that's what the labor of that is, right? It's like, we basically are killing ourselves. Like, we're collapsing our own narratives in the service of another person's understanding when they will never understand. And so it's just like, just make your work, man. Like, you know, like, and perhaps there are some things that like, you know, could be, right? But I do not, and I will not ever, I don't do that. I actually don't think I've ever done that as an image maker in the 20 years of me making work. Yeah, and I don't think you should either.
We've got 2 questions here in the center, and then we'll wrap up.
During your discussion today, you were talking about allowing now space. So turning the page, and you lit up talking about sculpture. So is that something you are already working toward?
In my brain, in my mind, like, you know, I have no idea what that means.
Well, if you saw your face when you even said the word, it just beamed.
Oh, thanks.
So we'll hope that there's something in the future.
Yeah, you know, and I again, like, I have zero clue. I have no idea. Like, I mean, it is also like the histories of it and like what, like, it's like sort of like the idea of like just like leaping into this like this other language that I have no idea what this language is. Like, you know, and I mean, I guess I could learn. I mean, obviously, I will have to learn, right? You know, what's really interesting is that like I started thinking about this, and then there's like a group of people who I am part of a crit group with, and we had our monthly meeting, and everybody was like, you know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about sculpture. And I was like, you too. Like, how do we do this? Like, how do we actually like start thinking about, like, I mean, I guess like not like sculpture, but like sort of like, how do we escape, like, not escape photography, that's like a wrong way of, and overly dramatic, but like really kind of like pushing up against some of the limitations about like the medium, or like trying to think about it in a different way, and like all of us for some reason landed on sculpture, and like, yeah. So now I guess we're gonna have to switch the title of our group to like photo and sculpture. I have no idea. Like, but I'm interested in this. Like, it seems like cool, and yeah. So.
Hi, Samantha. I'm Erica. I really enjoyed your show. I saw it a couple weeks ago, and I really liked your piece that was like the flashcards of all the ingredients. I love learning about like other cuisines and culinary traditions. And I was wondering why it was significant to you to make that piece and what your favorite ingredient is.
So, so the piece is not about culinary things, right? And like, I think often people have have basically sort of like used the presence of fruits and vegetables in my work to kind of like sort of like reduce the narrative into this idea that like I'm talking about food and culinary things, and I'm totally not, right? Like, and so what that work is essentially, yes, it is about like, so there are some of those things that like we use in cooking and we eat them and stuff like this, but it's actually like more about, it actually comes from when I was doing making the still lifes with fruits and vegetables, like just like kind of like the way that like they feel different in your hand, right? And like recording those gestures. And then thinking about the way that, so like, I mentioned before, or I think I might have mentioned that like, of the many things that kind of like had their origin in the Caribbean, botany was one of them, right? And so like there's like environment, there's sort of like the overall science of botany, and like, like I'm a scientist, my parents are scientists, right? So this is not like an anti-science thing, right? But like, and there's also sort of like economic botany, which is like, how do you run your plantation well, right? But the other part of botany, like sort of like the overall thing, is like really interesting to me because like often people would come from places like London or Paris, the metropole, and they would basically like use either the enslaved, the indentured, or the indigenous to help them find like new and exotic plants to bring back to, let's say, for example, Kew Gardens, right? And like the tradition is that like if you discover something, you have naming rights, right? And so, there are, so all of these plants which existed like in this world that already had names were now renamed, right? And in the act of being renamed under genus species names, and this like sort of like first dibs naming convention, a lot of this like vernacular, like this cultural knowledge gets erased, right? And the idea of like naming, so like the names of those like flashcards are like this kind of like intertwined series of vernaculars of like what like actually my family calls those things. Again, like I have like, it's like dual island, dual race kind of like, so there's a number of different vernaculars in that actual thing. And, renaming the fruits and veg by that vernacular name is like reintroducing or like kind of like, that understanding of what these things are, taking it outside of that, erasing sort of like genus species, like colonialist like perspective on these things. There's also kind of like a nod in some way, like the way that the things are set up to the herbarium, right? And like, so like an herbarium is something that like will show as much as possible like different parts of the plant, different facets of the plant. And so like that's what that work is about, it's really like about thinking about how systems of knowledge like have been co-opted and corrupted, and returning some of those systems of knowledge back to where they originated. And then, you know, of course, like there's like the sound piece, and so that's my mom and me, and yeah, like there, I mean, there's a very much like a difference in our accents because like I was raised in New Jersey and she was not, and but like it's like, you know, the knowledge sort of retains itself across borders, you know, and you know, like that piece too has been like someone has said like, you know, it's like shows the strain of the culture, but in fact the culture is very much alive, like, you know, and but it just sounds like this now, you know, microplastics. It just sounds like this, like, you know, so yeah. Thank you. You're welcome.
Something very beautiful about you seeing yourself in a Tupperware and us coming to microplastics as the way that we're.
I'm like, oh yeah, microplastics.
I'm gonna live forever.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I know, I really like that. I'm like, I kind of like that. It's like we're just everywhere. Ooh, you know, yeah.
Well,
Yes, Luke, thank you very much for being here. I'm so excited to have recorded this conversation today. Mia Laufer, who is the curator of this exhibition, will be delighted to see the trajectory of your conversation. And you were all here to see it and be able to think about these things. And again, it'll be available in a couple weeks online. So if there's something that you want to go back and think and kind of pull the thread a little bit further, it'll be there to follow that. So I encourage you to look on the website in a couple of weeks. So Luke, thank you very much for making the trip here. And Samantha, thank you again for coming back to Des Moines, for sharing your exhibition with us, and for this really wonderful conversation. So thank you both. Thank you, audience.
thank you.